2. Strange Beasts. A brief flick of his eyes to one side was all the acknowledgment old Davy gave to the coach which drew to a rapid halt in front of the mock Tudor facade of the Black Swan. Every day it passed through the village, but it had never paused in its journey before. Like everything else, this was hardly unusual enough for Davy to divert his attention towards it. Almost as soon as it had stopped, it began to move again, revealing 2 teenagers standing by a pile of rucksacks and sleeping bags. One of them, tall and dark-haired, threw an empty can at the rear windscreen of the coach, missing by several yards. "Hey, I hope your engine explodes," he shouted belligerently at the accelerating coach. "Cool it, David." The other laid a restraining hand on his shoulder. He was shorter than David and wore a blue padded raincoat. "No, I won't cool it, Jack." David brushed him off. "You jerk," he called to the absent driver. "I hope you get tyre rot." "Don't be stupid. There's no such thing," his friend told him. "No? Well, there ought to be. Geez, I hate this country." He looked around himself. 3 roads led out of the village. At the centre of the junction, a small patch of grass sprouted a spreading oak tree, whose leaves brushed against the black and white walls of the pub on one side, the red and yellow sign of a post office on another side, and overhung a rainbow-filled garden on the third side. David put out his hand to feel the rain and looked up at the drab sky. "It's so sunny all the time," he said sourly. "I bet they've never even heard of a malignant melanoma." Jack ignored his friend. After all, it had been David's idea to go for a quick wander around Wales before spending the rest of their vacation at home in America. He hefted his rucksack onto his back, the sleeping bag dangling by 2 short pieces of fraying string. "Come on, we'd better get going." "Where the heck are we anyway?" David asked, shouldering his pack. "Stupid driver, dumping us in the middle of nowhere." "Well, we're somewhere between Oswestry and Port Marion. Why don't we ask at the post office?" "Okay, you do that. I'll just wait here." He plunged his hands into the deep pockets of his bright red anorak and started to whistle Men of Harlech. "Right, I'll go over and ask." "Right." Jack went over to the post office and tried the door. It was locked. He shook the handle, as if this might somehow make it a little less locked. Peering through the wire-meshed glass, he searched amongst the American Express, Daily Mirror, and "It is against the law to sell cigarettes to under-16s" stickers for some indication of when it was open. Eventually he found it, and discovered that the post office was shut between 1 and 2 o'clock. He looked at his watch, and found that he had 38 minutes to wait. He stomped back over to David, who had acquired a pint glass from somewhere. "Oh, shoot, David! How is it you've got enough money for that, but you couldn't pay the full coach fare?" "Llanfair Caerog." "What?" He took a sip from the glass. "We're in Llanfair Caerog. Get the map out, Jack." Jack looked resentfully at David's drink as he swung his rucksack down onto the ground and rooted through the pockets for the ragged Ordnance Survey map. He unfolded it and tried to hold it so that the light breeze didn't blow it around, and so that it presented the minimum surface area to the continual drizzle. He scanned the names, lines and symbols until he eventually found the boldly printed Llanfair Caerog at the meeting point of 3 roads. "Here it is," he said, pointing it out to David. He quickly relinquished his hold as the map was pulled away from him. "Where? Let me see." David waved the map around in one hand until it was reasonably easy to read. He studied it briefly and then said, looking around, "Which road did we come in on?" Jack realised that he hadn't the faintest idea. It was this one, wasn't it?" "Yeah, I think you're right." "Put on your pack, Jack. We go this way." Old Davy watched as the 2 young Americans strode along the road up to Emrys's Valley, and wondered why they hadn't looked at the signpost in the middle of the junction. He didn't even flinch when he heard David's glass smash. It was probably when they had been passing through a small, utterly forgettable town, nestling happy in a twist of the Rhine, that Jack had realised what a complete lunatic his travelling companion was. Jack had known David for quite some time, and had thought that he had known him quite well for most of that time. The crossing of the English Channel seemed to have changed David's character irretrievably. Maybe it was the drinking water. To return to the town on the Rhine, however. It was a rather drab, dull and boring day, and they'd been making their way to a goat's milk cheese tasting festival. They had been walking alongside a murky pool which had been cut off from the river by the drought afflicting the entirety of continental Europe, when suddenly, and with no warning, David had dropped his backpack and leapt headfirst into the oily, stagnant waters. Seconds later, he re-emerged, spluttering and triumphantly clutching a lady's silk undergarment. And this was before he had spent 5 hours tasting free samples at a nearby vineyard. After trying the German wine, of course, David had wandered around wearing the silk underwear on his head. But at that level of intoxication it was understandable. It was just the initial retrieval that had shaken Jack up. Since then, Jack had had frequent cause to ponder on the condition of David's sanity. After a month of climbing ship's funnels, lying down in Italian fountains, swimming in the North Sea at 2 a.m, and doing things to donkeys that even a Spaniard would balk at, it should have come to no surprise that David should suddenly fling a half-empty beer glass against a wall, slip out of the straps of his rucksack, and leap headfirst into the thick, wet grass of the roadside verge. In fact, it was almost an exact repetition of the underwear incident, except that this time David arose clutching in one hand a rather startled-looking frog. "Christ's sakes, David, what did you do that for?" Jack asked, indicating the fragments of glass. David ignored this. "Got us something to eat, Jack. Make a nice change from beans." "Don't be disgusting!" "Hey, what's so disgusting about eating frogs? The French do it all the time." Jack picked up the rucksack and held it out for David. "No, they don't. They just eat the legs. Even they aren't sicko enough to eat the whole frog. Only a Pennsylvanian would do that." David held the frog up to the light and examined it more closely. "Maybe it's not a frog. Maybe it's a toad." "What difference does it make?" Jack sighed. "I wonder how you tell. Do frogs have warts and toads not?" "How the heck should I know, David?" "You're the biology student. Come on, what's the difference between a frog and a toad?" "Is this a joke?" "Hey, no, I'm serious. What's the difference?" "Maybe it's like toadstools and mushrooms. Maybe toads are poisonous." To Jack's horror, David suddenly brought the frog up to his mouth and started chewing. Nope. No ill effects. Must be frog." "David!" "You're such a dork, Jack." He opened his hand and let the frog hop off into the grass. He took his pack and slung it onto his back, then he started walking. Jack had to take a few quick steps to catch up with him. "That was gross. You're one sick guy, you know that?" David continued looking forward and merely replied, "Ribbit." "Shut up, David." "Ribbit." "Shut up, David." "Ribbit." About 1.5 miles outside the tiny crossroads which had appeared to make up the entirety of Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwyrndrobwllllantysiliogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogo that ran along the valley bottom. Trees crowded into the level ground and overhung the badly cracked and pocked tarmac, through which poked the occasional tuft of lush grass. Even beyond the high precipitation so normal in the British Isles, the air was damp and muggy, and Jack felt perspiration begin to bead his brow as he and David meandered down the descending road. He peered into the dimness under the thick leafy roof in the hope of seeing some of the native wildlife. Nothing moved, but in the distance he could hear a whippoorwill shouting its characteristic call out to the world. He corrected himself in his thoughts. It wasn't a whippoorwill here. In England, rather Wales, it should be called a nightjar. He stumbled as his foot twisted in a fissure in the road. It was definitely getting more and more dilapidated. "Hey, Kermit, are you sure this is the right road?" David shrugged. "You looked at the map, you tell me." Jack recognised the stages leading up to another miscarriage of justice. Stage 1 was David making a decision. Stage 2 was Jack discovering that David's decision was wrong. Stage 3 was David maintaining that it had been Jack's decision. Stage 4 was Jack getting angry, whilst David remained perfectly calm. Inevitably, the blame for them coming along this road would ultimately lie with him. He decided to avoid David's suggestion of guilt completely. "Well, I don't think it is," he said. "I mean, British roads may be bad, but a major road shouldn't have potholes like this." There was no doubt at all that the holes in the road were huge. He almost expected a bearded university lecturer in a hard hat and luminous yellow waterproofs to appear from one and start to enthuse about the marvellous rock formations in the subterranean world. "Maybe we should go back," he suggested, stopping walking. "Oh, come on, Jack. It must lead somewhere. Let's give it a couple more miles." Jack threw a daggered look at David's back, but followed, mumbling angrily to himself. Indeed, after only a further half-mile of the couple more miles, the road was abruptly cut off by a tall metal mesh gate from which various notices in Welsh and English hung tattily, drawn as they were on the sides of soggy supermarket boxes. The words were written in an erratic, spidery hand. "Keep out," one announced tersely in black ink. The message was continued in a second card a few inches below. "Trespassers will be shot." "Looks like the end of the road," Jack said, with a definite tinge of smugness affecting his voice. Futilely, David rattled the gates, but they were held securely by a large, highly polished padlock and chain. He turned and surveyed his surroundings with a calculating look in his eye. "I reckon that if we cut across those woods, we'd get onto the main road in no time." "No, David," Jack protested, knowing that he had already lost the argument to the forces of illogic. "Why don't we just walk back along the road?" "Jack," David gave his winning smile. "Jackie boy, have you seen what time it is? If we go all the way back there, we'll probably end up camping in the middle of nowhere, and, forgive me for saying it, in this weather, that is something I, for one, can do without. Do you read what I'm saying, man? Like, are we on a similar wavelength here?" Jack counted very slowly up to 10, and then through gritted teeth he said, "David, I am already soaked to the skin, and I have no desire whatsoever, you know, even if I just had Lake Michigan emptied over me, to tramp through uncharted tracks of knee-length sodden grass just to cut a lousy hour off walking to some god-forsaken place." The sudden transition that David underwent was amazing in its extremity. From talking like some sort of 60s reject, he switched over to total aggression. He waved his fist in Jack's face and shouted, "Hey, Jack, if you want to get your butt frozen off unnecessarily, well then, that's just cool. Just fine, just hunky-dory. But don't expect me to feel the same way. I'll see you in New England." He turned and stormed off the road. A few feet into the reeds, he vanished with a yell. Alarmed, Jack dashed forward. David lay collapsed in a heap at the bottom of a 6-foot ditch, concealed by the tall grass. Suddenly, David burst out laughing, and Jack had to join him. He nodded his head. "Okay, David, we'll go your way," he agreed. They followed the fence through the trees, but when it suddenly rose precipitously up the hillside, they decided to take the route of least effort. A V-shaped gash in the hillside offered a quick passage into the next valley. It also gave some relief from the long, damp grass, though the replacement, a slippery sheen of dark red mud, wasn't much better. Thankfully, the brief altercation had cleared the air between the two Americans and had lifted their spirits considerably. In the next valley, the trees clustered around them again, though maybe not quite as thick as before. Eventually, they reached a stream running through the bottom of the valley. At this level, the stream was a bit too wide, deep, and, importantly, wet for them to cross. They decided to walk along it until it grew narrow enough for them to jump. The muted woodland sounds were overlaid with the constant sound of water running inexorably downwards between sky and soil. In the distance, a dog barked, driven to distraction by some unseen diversion. Even the drizzle had fallen to a minimum, and occasional shafts of sunlight danced fitfully on the water. A rainbow, like a phoenix rising from the ruins of the afternoon, spread across the sky. Jack found his breathing becoming more and more relaxed as he basked in the pleasurable sensations. "Now, this is better," said David, obviously enjoying the stimulation as much as Jack. "The weather's finally sorted itself out." "Don't say anything," Jack warned him. "It could change at a moment's notice. You should know that." "Yeah. Hey, you know there's something familiar about this place. He shook his head as though to dislodge the memory from its dusty shelf high above the central processing unit. Jack examined the stream. "I guess we could get across now," he said. "No. If we carry on along here, we'll meet the road eventually." "What? How do you know? You're just making that up." "No, I think I've been here before. Let me look at the map." Jack turned round and let David rummage through his rucksack. He tugged the map free and opened it wide. Holding it in one hand, he tracked across it with his index finger until he found Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr. "Look," he said, "this is the stream, and the road to Gwydir crosses it just here. See?" "You're right. How about that? You really have been here before." "Hey, what am I, a sky brain?" He slapped his forehead. "Course I've been here. Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr. My mum and dad used to come camping here when they first met at uni. I remember now. I was 5 years old." He was 5 years old, and he was hopelessly lost in the woods. "Mummy, Mummy!" he shouted, bawling at the top of his voice. There was no reply, and he began to cry, snuffling in between repeating his call. It was a horrid wood. At first he had liked it, because he was getting covered in mud and could play at being Flash Thunderbolt, leader of the Free Force warriors, hiding behind the trees and occasionally risking a shot at the loathsome clawmen. When, at last, he had finally caught the evil Gagnak, he had noticed that it had started raining, and the skies had changed to a glowering dark grey that turned the wood into a nasty place full of shadows. He realised that in the pitched laser battle he had completely lost his sense of direction. Now the mud was sucking at him, holding him back. The trees clawed at him, and when he tried to shelter from the rain, the trunk glistened repulsively with green slime. Panic-stricken, he ran, stumbling, through the maze of trees until he arrived at the bank of the stream. On the far side was an overhanging rock face, where he could cower away from the worst of the rain. He splashed across the icy water of the stream and stood shivering. Apart from the splash, splash, splash of the rain and the gurgling stream, there was no sound. He let out another heart-rending cry. "Mummy! Daddy, where are you?" In the woods, on the other side of the stream, something moved. He peered into the gloom and began to chew savagely on his thumb. What was it? Again he saw a dark flash between two trees, moving closer. "Mummy!" he whimpered, scared even more than before. There it was again, darting between the trees. He began to run, slipping and sliding along the stream, not looking back, and then he had fallen into his mummy's consoling arms. The nightmare forgotten, consigned to the mists of oblivion, but it lingered at the edge of his subconscious, waiting to re-emerge. And something else lingered too, and the place remained in his mind. I remember now. I was 5 years old. Mum and Dad brought me here once, and then the year after we moved home to the States. Geez, ain't this a coincidence? For some reason he gave a slight shiver at the thought, as though a shadow had just fallen upon his grave. The place hasn't changed much. He looked round wonderingly. The stream was now pulling out of the woods and beginning to run in a gully cut out of the hillside. It was shallow enough that in places its rocky bed projected above the water. I can't remember anything from when I was that young, Jack decided after straining his memory. Except getting a kiss off Rosie Bond for a quarter. David laughed coarsely. I bet even back then she kissed like, "What the heck?" "What is it?" "Look up there." David pointed up the stream. Laying in the water was a horse, one of its legs projecting at an unsightly angle. There appeared to be a rider crushed under the weight of the huge animal. Neither was moving. Jack and David set off at a run up the stream bed. As he went, Jack couldn't help noticing that the rider was naked from the waist up. Within a few seconds they were standing over the horse. David's eyes widened in surprise, and Jack crouched down to get a closer look. "Jesus Christ," he said softly, and turned to look up at David. "This isn't a man, it's a goddamn centaur!" There could be no doubt about it in either of their minds. The creature before them had the body of a horse, but where its head should have been, there was the upper half of a man. Fine hair covered his skin, tinting it to the colour of his horse half, whilst at the same time the cold turned his skin a pale blue colour. A matted mane hung down his back, mingling with the mud of the stream bed. One of his legs was very obviously broken. After the initial shock had worn off, they were nonplussed as to what they should do. Jack felt around for some signs of life. "Where do you look for a pulse in the centaur? I've tried in the wrist, and there's maybe something, but I can't be sure." "Try the jugular," suggested David. "I have. Doesn't seem to be one." "Hey, wait a minute. Here we are." David was feeling around the leg and had finally detected a fluttering pulse. "He's alive! I think we ought to get him out of the water and cover him up, or he won't be alive for long." "Are you sure we should move him? I mean, with that leg broken and everything?" "It'll kill him if we don't. Come on, you take the front end, and I'll push at the back." They struggled to little effect for a couple of minutes, until finally the centaur began to slide over the mud. Once he was moving, they managed to slide him a few inches away from the stream. His flank was still partially immersed, but his human part, which they assumed was the most important segment, was out of the water. Jack took a towel from his rucksack and shoved it under the torso. Then he pulled a sweater over the centaur's head. "We'll have to get some help. There's nothing we can do by ourselves." "But Jack, what are we going to say to someone? 'Hi there, we found a centaur, will you help us?'" "They'll help us all right, into a little white van." "Well, if we find a doctor and just tell him that there's a rider who's had an accident." "Yeah, okay, one of us will have to stay up here. You go back down to Llanfaircairog and try to phone from the pub. I'll make some soup up and try to keep him warm." "Right, I'll try and be as quick as I can." "I couldn't believe it. I mean, bam! He just shot his gun like that. Bam!" "All right, Ace," the doctor said soothingly. "Calm down and start at the beginning." Ace took a deep breath and told the doctor about her trip into the next valley. As she approached the point where the man had fired his gun, she became more and more excited. "So anyway, I could see that he was about to shoot, so I dropped, right? But at the last moment he turned the gun upwards and fired into the air. Then he just poked me with the gun and told me to get off his land." "That sounds like Emrys all right," commented Hugh. The doctor turned to him questioningly. "Emrys?" "Emrys Hughes," Hugh said. "Him and his family have lived in that valley for the last 150 years. They won't have anyone trespassing. His old da was up before the magistrate for giving a walker a backside full of shot not long before he died. Nothing ever came of it, of course. They've got a lot of influence, that bunch. They're an odd lot, and no mistake." "What was that about a village?" the doctor suddenly asked irrelevantly. "Oh, yeah, right. There was a sort of like a load of old ruins. Maybe it was just a farm or something. There was an old well there too." "That'll be Dinorban," Janet said. "Dinorban?" Asa asked. The doctor raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Dinorban," Janet repeated. "I've got something about it in one of my books, though, of course, the real person to ask is Leia down in the village. She's the expert on all things local, past and present." She scanned the bookshelves and finally traced the slim pamphlet she was looking for. "Why are you interested in the village, Doctor?" Hugh asked. Oh, I'm interested in everything. Follow every clue, climb every mountain, ford every stream. Ace recognised the telltale signs of the doctor attempting to conceal something, but as yet there didn't seem to be anything worth concealing. "Here it is," Janet said, and she began to quote from the pamphlet. "In the mid-19th century, 10 families from Lancashire founded the village of Dinorban 3 miles to the southwest of Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwyrndrobwllllantysiliogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogo remained there, the families had enormous problems, a great many of which they blamed on the local people. All of their sheep were stolen, according to the diary of one of the young girls, and in the last summer the crops were ruined by the actions of some huge beast. Dinorban was emptied overnight, presumably because of the failure to produce even a subsistence crop. "Well, that's very interesting," Ace said, clearly bored. "But what's it got to do with me being shot at?" "Be quiet, Ace." "Is there anything else, Janet?" "No, not really, only... Oh yes, here's something. The disappearance of the cooperative was not the first to happen on the site of Dinorban. According to Gildas, a Roman villa somewhere in the vicinity was deserted by its inhabitants with no trace as to where they went. "This is fascinating," the doctor told the others. "Ace, I think you and I should pay Dinorban a visit." "But what about this Emrys bloke?" "Yes, Doctor. He's a dangerous man, isn't he, Hubach?" "Oh, I shouldn't think we'll have any problems. How about something to eat first?" Feet squelching, Jack followed the road down the valley into Llanfair Caerog. Every time his feet hit the ground, water oozed up between his toes, trickling unpleasantly into the fibres of his thick woolen socks. And then, like a sponge, the soul reabsorbed the water in preparation for another outflow. It was a form of water torture which Jack had not expected to encounter during the summer months. But had he really expected to be spending those months in the British Isles? He trudged on, and wondered how he was going to persuade a vet to come and minister to a centaur. And was it really a vet they wanted? After all, half of a centaur is human. Maybe he should get a doctor. Maybe he should call the police. Maybe even get them all. No, he decided. A vet first, as it was the leg that was broken, and once somebody with authority was involved, the rest would become easier. Jack looked at his watch, and his eyes widened. Good grief. It was coming up to 5 o'clock. They had spent 4 hours wandering around Llanfair Caerog and its environs. A thick bank of grey cloud was beginning to settle on the tops of the hills and was giving every impression that it would sink further. He hoped that David would be all right by himself. When he finally reached the road junction, Jack hurried to the unusual phone booth by the post office. He tugged at the door, but it wouldn't open. When at last he managed to open the small panel and found the phone, the dialling tone was absent, and there didn't appear to be any point in trying to use it. Apart from that, he had no idea what number he should be ringing. In disgust, he slammed the blue panel closed and turned to look around himself. Being a student, his attention immediately focused on the pub. There would almost certainly be a phone there. When he entered, everything was quiet. It didn't go quiet. There weren't surly natives glaring at him and muttering dark things about going up to the castle after dark. It was just quiet, except for a luridly flashing fruit machine which trilled noisily to itself once in a while. Jack searched in his pockets for his few remaining coins and then made his way over to the bar. He stood drumming his fingers and looking about the place, and was just on the verge of coughing loudly to himself when the barman appeared, heralded by a triumphant whoop from the fruit machine. A half of mild, please, and do you have a phone I could use?" "Half of mild, sir, very good. And what are you doing in these parts?" "Oh, just passing through, hiking." "Hiking, eh? Good thing for a lad your age. See the world while you still can, before you get tied down to one place with a boring job, wife and kids. American, aren't you?" "Yeah, you noticed, huh? Do you have a... I went to America a few years back. Didn't like it one bit. The only thing louder than Americans is their shirts. Bloody awful place, if you don't mind me saying so." He handed over the glass. "No, that's all right. I hate the British too." Jack wished that David had been there to say that, but he wasn't. So Jack just shrugged non-committally. 42 pence, sir. Thank you very much. Thanks. Do you have a phone I could use? Just over there in the corner. A dog-eared copy of the Yellow Pages rested on a ledge underneath the phone, and it was the work of a moment to flick through and find the section headed Veterinary Surgeons and Practitioners. He dropped a couple of coins into the phone and dialed a likely number. While he listened to the ringing, he turned and watched the barman assiduously polishing the already gleaming oak surface. Hello, Evans, Riley and Skerritt Veterinary Practice. Can I help you? Yes. There's been a sort of accident with a horse just off the road between Gwydir and Llanfair Caerog, and The beeps started, and Jack fumbled another coin into the slot. Not really within this practice's area. Perhaps you should call Mr. Taylor in Gwydir. The receptionist gave him a phone number, and he traced it in the directory. Oh, thanks very much. My pleasure. Goodbye. Bye. Jack rang the new number. This time he got a recorded message. Mr. Taylor is not in at the moment, but if you would like to leave details after the tone, he will get back to you as soon as he has returned from his rounds. Jack left a brief message and then put down the phone. He sat at one of the tables and sipped the rest of his drink. A paper discarded on an adjacent table caught his eye. He had been in England long enough to know that the Daily Spotter was the equivalent of the States' National Enquirer, and he wondered what they would pay for actual pictures of a real-life centaur. Eagerly, he picked up the newspaper and searched its pages. He found what he was looking for and returned to the phone. "Hello, Newbury here. What is it?" a bored voice asked. "Hi, I'm an American. I'm visiting Wales, and I've seen something that I thought your paper might like to run a feature on." "I doubt it very much, son. I mean, there's nothing in Wales but sheep, and nobody's interested in them. Except the Welsh, and we've done all the rest. Celtic fertility rites, human sacrifice, Tom Jones's love life. We've seen it, Gov, and so's Joe Public." No, this is something different. This is a centaur." "A what? Centaur of what?" "No, a centaur. You know, half man, half horse." "You what?" Jack carefully explained about centaurs. There had, after all, been some use in playing Dungeons and Dragons for most of the time he was suffering puberty. Eventually, the reporter summed up. "So, you're saying that somebody's been crossing men with the GGs?" Although he couldn't be seen, Jack shrugged his shoulders and said, "Hey, could be." Newbury snorted. "Pull the other one." "What would you pay for photos?" "We only pay on site, 50 quid maybe." "Right, I'll be in touch. Bye." He dropped the phone. It had been worth a try. Money comes to those who sell sensational pictures. He drained his glass and left it in the centre of the table. The barman's eyes followed him as he went out. He had been one of the very few customers that Arthur Denver had these days, ever since he had somehow managed to get himself on the wrong side of the Welsh populace. When Arthur arrived in Llanfair Caerog, he'd understood the feelings that caused such anger among some people. He'd lived in the countryside and knew only too well the irritation of city folks and their holiday homes. He'd thought that his situation was different. After all, he was working, not just leaving a perfectly good house unoccupied for 11 months of the year. But one night he'd made a bad mistake. There was one farmer who seemed to intimidate the other villagers, and that night he'd been going out of his way to be as loud-mouthed and obnoxious as he possibly could be to a group of tourists. Arthur had thrown him out, to general applause from all those present. But then it had all gone wrong. He couldn't say that the farmer was a member of Maybe and Gwydir, but he had done something to persuade others that it would be in their best interests not to frequent the Black Swan. Some of Arthur's neighbours gave him pitying smiles, but nothing more. Only old Davy, oblivious to changes in the world around him, remained his loyal customer. It wasn't enough. Soon the Black Swan would pirouette its last and settle to the ground with its wings folded over its head in a deathly embrace. Arthur was leaving. Jack wondered what he should do. He'd called the vet and given him the details, or at least he'd given believable details, and now he really ought to go back up to David. but his limbs were aching with the fatigue induced by several hours walking in dampness. He was on the verge of going back into the pub and hunkering down in front of the fire, when down the road from the east he saw a figure descending at some speed on an ancient bicycle. There could be no mistaking that this was the village policeman, a stocky individual bombing right out of a Hollywood London astride a battered Rayleigh that had seen far better days. As the policeman neared, Jack waved at him to stop, eliciting a high banshee wail of brakes against metal, which brought the bike to a halt a few inches from Jack's feet. "Hello there, boyo. What can I do for you, eh?" "You're a police officer?" "No, lad, I'm a ballet dancer. I just wear the uniform over my tights." "Oh, yeah, well, I'd like to report an accident." "Hmm?" "Up in the hills," Jack elaborated. "So? What's happened?" "Me and a friend of mine were walking over to Gwydir along the stream that runs up this valley." The policeman nodded. "I know what you mean." "We found this, sort of a horse rider. His horse has fallen and broken its leg, and he's been laying in the water, so, he may have pneumonia or something." "A horse rider, you say? Just a horse rider?" "Yeah, well, sort of. The thing is it near to where the stream crosses the Gwydir Road?" "About a kilometre below it." "And your friend's up there, is he? What's his name?" David Gibson. I'm Jack Pilgrim." "Right. Thanks for reporting it. I'll get up there and do something about it." Without another word, the policeman kicked off and began pedalling furiously away. Jack shouted after him, "What should I do?" but got no response. He resigned himself to walking back up to David. But first he turned back to the pub. He gave an uneasy smile to the old man sitting on the bench beside the door, and then went back in. "Hi again." Arthur looked up in surprise. "Oh, hello. Back so soon. Could you cash some traveller's checks for me?" A worried frown crossed Arthur's face as he wondered whether the interests of customer relations extended to such an act. Nothing to lose, really. "How much?" he asked cautiously. 20? Jack proposed. Arthur gave an inward sigh of relief. That much could be coped with. "Sure," he said. "Great!" Jack scrawled his signature on one of the checks and handed it over. He saw, as Arthur took out the cash, how sparsely filled the till was. "$5 all right. There you go." "Thanks very much. Bye." Arthur watched him go disappointedly. The lads could have at least bought another drink while he was in. Ace laid the knife and fork across the emptied plate and sat back contentedly, still savouring the lingering taste sensations. A warm glow perfused her body. She looked across at the doctor's plate. It was still heaped high with the fourth helping that Janet had given him. "That was brilliant," she beamed. "I could eat it again." Janet smiled and answered apologetically. "Ah, well, I'm afraid the doctor scraped the pots bare. Absolutely delicious. I'd have to think back a couple of centuries to come up with a better. Let me see. Lucretia, Stephen. Ah, yes. Elizabeth's coronation feast was good." "You were at the Queen's coronation dinner?" Ace asked unbelievingly. She'd joined in the royal wedding street party and binged on green jelly and cream buns, whilst bunting in patriotic colours waved pathetically between lampposts. "What was it like?" "Oh, very nice. If only Essex hadn't started throwing drumsticks about." "Do you remember watching the coronation on the television, Hugh?" Janet asked. "Couldn't forget it, could I? We all piled into the bus and drove down to Dr. Snape's house in Gwydir, and Gareth stood in front of me the whole time, so I couldn't see a blasted thing. Should have stayed at home and listened to the radio." "Who's Gareth?" asked Ace. "My little brother. Emigrated to Australia in the 60s, Janet told her. "Bit on the backside by a bloody great spider and died out there," added Hugh. "Oh, sorry." "Never mind, love. It all happened a long time ago." "Nasty things, some spiders," the doctor said. "I seem to recall one almost killed me. The memories are vague. A redback, was it?" "I don't think he noticed the type." "No, I suppose not. Not if he was taken by surprise. This food is really excellent. You must give me a sample so that I can program it into the TARDIS food machine." He stopped and sighed heavily. Hugh pushed his plate into the centre of the table and half rose from his chair. "Tea?" he asked, looking around. "Oh, yes, please," Ace said. The doctor nodded in agreement. "That's right. You put the kettle on the Aga, love, and I'll put the apple pie out." They bustled around the tiny kitchen, and before long a dish full of pie smothered in thick, creamy custard alighted in front of Ace. She dug in eagerly. By the time she'd finished, a steamy whistle was just beginning. Hugh poured out the 4 mugs of tea and set them down in a cluster in the middle of the table. "There you go, take your pick," he told them, and took the milkiest for himself. Ace slid a mug over and sipped at it, watching the doctor finish his meal. She began to shift impatiently and finally could contain herself no longer. "Professor, when are we going to go over to that village? It's 6 o'clock now. Surely it's about time." "Patience is a virtue, my dear," Janet told her, "which you have exercised remarkably well. I think the doctor is waiting until your excursion is less likely to be noticed by our friend Emrys. Isn't that so, Doctor?" She looked to the small figure for confirmation, but he merely gazed down into the swirling vortex of tea in his mug. "But," Ace protested, "if we leave it too late, we won't be able to see anything either. Come on, Professor. We've got to do something." The doctor looked up, one eyebrow raised as if he was surprised at her remark. "Do we, Ace? Do we always have to do something to interfere? The village interests me, so does the circle. Emrys less so. But this is meant to be a break, R&R, a holiday, a furlough. But he shot at me." And then Ace leaned across the table and said more pointedly, "And why did the TARDIS bring us here? You can't tell me it was for a holiday." "Wasn't it? Maybe she does just need a rest. She's been through bad times recently. She's been damaged badly. Maybe she needs time to recover." "But the cat—" I know. But sometimes I feel I ought to resist the flow of events dragging me into involvement. Maybe it's my training struggling to the surface. Perhaps I'm just a bone-weary traveller. Perhaps I need a rest too. No exploring ancient deserted villages, no examining stone circles, no quarrels with irate landowners." "But Professor, what about—" The doctor suddenly leapt to his feet. "What indeed? What are we waiting for, Ace? We're not the stay-at-home types. Adventure is in our blood and in our souls. Let's see what we can find. Ghosts of long-dead villagers, their chains are clanking, primitive druidic rituals performed by the light of a gibbous moon. Who cares? Let's go." Ace shook her head in bemusement. "I wish you'd make up your mind. One moment it's, I don't feel like it. The next is, all go. I am a man of passion and extremes," the doctor told her pompously. "Could almost be a Welshman," said Hugh, evoking a derisive snort of laughter from Janet. "Ha! Passions and extremes. That's a good one. I'll have to remember that one, Hugh, my love. The only thing you're passionate about is those sheep. And you, my love. And you." "Come along, Ace." "Right, where did I leave my rucksack?" "I put it in the hall, love," Janet told her. "Ta! See you later." It being early summer, the sun was still trying to force its way through the clouds, but amongst the trees in the bottom of the valley below Hugh and Janet's farm, pools of shadow and mist swirled together in equal quantities. Ace and the doctor picked their way through the sparse undergrowth in the direction of the stream, shaking off the snagging of brambles against their clothes with ease. "A friend of mine once came to Wales," Ace told the doctor. "He stayed in a place called Colwyn Bay. A complete dump, he said it was. Looked like somebody had picked up a town and lobbed it against a cliff. Splat." "The splendours of the North Wales coastline should not be mocked," the doctor reprimanded her, pushing a branch out of his path. "There's a wonderful little fish and chip shop in the Rill whose spam fritters can't be equalled this side of the Crab Nebula. I must take you there sometime." "I don't like spam." "Well, I'll have your spam then. I love it. Did I ever tell you about the time I visited Wales in the 50s? The 1950s, that is." "Yes." "Did I? I must remember to stop repeating myself. Did I tell you about the time I visited Wales in the 50s? Yes. I must look up old Gronwy sometime. That 1928 Hibby Blossom you finished off was made by him. I know! Look, here's the stream in the rock face. Looks a bit slippery to go climbing. Perhaps you'd better give it a miss. We can jump across the stream here, and then if we go a bit upstream, we can go up the hillside. She leapt across to the other side and waited for the doctor to follow. He stood gazing upwards, his mind apparently on other things. Professor, come on! The leap that he performed was amazing. From a standing position, he took off in an arc that seemed sure to leave him a foot short of the solid ground. But at the last moment, he extended a leg and landed easily. He twirled his brolly, winked at Ace, and then set off in the direction she had indicated. The walk up the valley was easy, and even when they turned up the slope, the going wasn't hard. Ace found herself slightly out of breath, but the doctor showed no similar signs of weakness. When they reached the barbed wire and the warning notices, the doctor blithely ignored them as Ace had done before. He pressed down the wire with the tip of his umbrella so she could step over, and then, by another impressive feat of acrobatics, held it down for himself while he followed her. A couple of minutes further walk, and they arrived on the ridge which looked down into both valleys. They were rather exposed here, the undergrowth in the valley they had just left ending a few metres below the crest of the hill, and though the valley spread before them was filled with trees, these did not extend further than the lowest slopes. "Should we go down?" asked Ace. "No." The doctor put a hand on her shoulder and pulled her down so that they were both crouched. "Look down there." He pointed amongst the trees where an indentation in the green surface suggested that the road ran between them. In brief glimpses and flashes, Ace saw a light bobbing slowly along the road, being carried probably, judging by its speed. "Well, if he's carrying a torch, that means we'll have plenty of warning if he's coming after us." "Not necessarily, Ace. I think for now we should just view the layout of the land. Fix details in our minds for when we actually go there. Now, that, I presume, is the site of the stone circle. In fact, the clearing where the circle must be was quite obvious with only a cursory glance." Ace nodded. "And the village is around the road just before it ends at the circle. Now, look over there. That's where the road from Llanfair comes on to Emerus's land. Can you see there's a gate across the road? And there is Emerus's house. No lights on, but it's still bright enough for that not to be necessary. So for all we know, that light may not be Emerus himself, and there be more than just him wandering the land and ready to shoot." Ace was only half paying attention. "Look, Professor! He's reached the circle! Look, Professor!" She shook him urgently and pointed down at the circle. Another light had appeared, but this one was unsteady, flickering and twinkling. Firelight. As they watched, more and more points of light appeared, moving around the clearing. "Looks like quiet meeting, doesn't it, Professor?" "Quiet, Ace," the doctor muttered. "Oh, come off it, Professor. You can't possibly hear what they're saying." "Shh." The doctor realised that unless he gave some sort of explanation, Ace would continue babbling and drowning out the sound he was listening for. "There's something about the way those torches are lighting up. It seems quite characteristic, but I'm trying to listen for something to confirm it." "What do you mean?" "A characteristic air movement that... No, it's no good. We shall have to go down there to check. Come on, Ace." "Great!" Ace leapt up and started towards the slope. The doctor caught her just before she went down. "Not that way. Not with all those people down there. We'll leave it till tomorrow. Let's get back to Hugh and Janet." Janet looked up from her paper and gazed across the room to where Hugh was dozing in front of the fire. A tuft of his white hair fell across his forehead and, judging by the way he shook his head to shift it every couple of minutes, tickled his eyes. She folded the paper neatly and laid it on the sideboard next to her chair. Easing herself forward, she rose and went to nudge Hugh's shoulder softly. Love, Defresh." What is it?" "Hadn't you better go and bring the sheep in? There was the warning about a dog on the loose, don't forget." "Oh, yes. I suppose I ought to. Doctor and Ace back, are they?" "No, not yet." "Ah." He seemed to sink back into a doze for a moment. Janet nudged him again. Right, the sheep. He rose and went into the kitchen. Janet followed him through and watched him pulling on his boots. I'll put the kettle on. Good. Nice cup of tea'd be wonderful. He went out through the back door, and Janet watched him going up to the gate into the field. Then she picked up the kettle and turned to fill it with water. Ace clambered over the low stone wall that ran alongside the road and lent the doctor a hand to help pull him over. So, the plan is that we go over there first thing tomorrow morning and have a deco. Ace, where in the universe did you pick up that expression? Perryvale, I think. Why? It doesn't seem quite you, that's all. The doctor paused to brush the accumulated lichen off his trousers, and suddenly the air was pierced by a scream. That's from the farm, Ace shouted, setting off at a run up the road. Not from the house, the doctor called. He was ignoring the road and had leapt over the opposite wall and was heading across the field towards the small barn behind the house. Ace knew that he must be right and followed suit. The route they were taking would get them to the scream's source much more directly. She looked ahead and saw Janet standing at the gate to the field, one hand clasped across her mouth. Hugh was standing in front of the barn, waving threateningly at something hidden by the intervening wall. Ahead of her, the doctor vaulted the wall and Ace came to a quick halt against it, prepared to jump over should it be necessary. She now saw what they were up against. On the ground lay a sheep, its fleece streaked red where sharp teeth had torn its flesh. It was still moving slightly, and its face writhed to let out a muted, strangled bleating. Crouched over the sheep was a dog? It was silvery grey with a lively, muscled body, powerful and strong. A wide ruff of hair exaggerated its neck and gave its forequarters a bulky look. Eyes, deep black and menacing, stared out fiercely above lips, pulled well back to reveal yellow, blood-stained teeth. Canines and incisors as effective at their job as any butcher's tools. A savage growl rumbled in the creature's throat, and it looked between its assailants wildly, as though trying to decide what move it should make. In one rapid, fluid motion, it flung itself at the doctor and bore him to the ground. Ace was over the wall in a flash, but she couldn't bring herself to attack this ferocious creature. "Janet, get my gun," Hugh spoke, quietly but firmly. As she started to back away, the pitch of the growling rose. "No, don't move," the doctor said equally firmly. "I think if I can just—" The creature reacted swiftly. Eyes flashed and teeth struck. Jack looked at the figure by the road with some surprise. There was no mistaking that coat. It had to be David. But why hadn't he stayed with the centaur? What was he doing up on the road? The figure waved and started walking towards him. Well, he'd get his answer soon enough. Indeed, within a couple of minutes, they were within shouting distance. "Hey, David, what are you doing up here? You're meant to be looking after Joe's centaur." "Yeah, well, this policeman guy came along and told me that he had sought out first aid and that I should come and wait for you so that you didn't miss the stream in the mist." They finally reached each other, and David turned and continued walking in the same direction as Jack. "How could I miss the stream, David?" "I don't know. I was just doing what I was told. Best to do what the cops tell you, you know." "Oh, you'd know all about that, wouldn't you?" "Well, I've been in my fair share of precincts. But hey, Jack, have I got news for you? The horseman came round while you were gone. I think it must be that tomato soup I gave it. Better write to the manufacturers. They may give you samples if you let them use our tomato soup brings even centaurs back to life." "Do you want to know what he said?" "Run it by me, David. Here's the stream now. I think we should get down there. He was fading pretty fast when I left. There may not be much more chance to see a living centaur again." They hurried down along the stream, making no attempt to stop themselves slipping in the mud. "So, what did he say?" "You know, that policeman was sort of weird. He turned up on this old bike ride. He'd ridden it down the stream. But he had this canister with him, and you know, I'd swear it was petrol." "Petrol?" "Yeah, to light a fire to keep Chiron warm. I was just surprised that he had it with him." Jack looked ahead and saw that there was indeed a fire burning in the gully through which the stream ran. But it was so big, and wasn't it moving? "Oh my God," he cried. "What have you done, David?" David was left standing as Jack headed off. "What do you mean, what have I done?" Jack could have thrown up at the sight that greeted his eyes, and the mixed stench of petrol and burning flesh that dripped through his nose. The policeman stood on the other side of the stream, his face illuminated by the pale light that the ghastly flames gave off. "Christ, do something!" shouted Jack, and now David was beside him, trying to kick, throw, and splash water onto the burning animal. Jack scooped up mud and smeared it on to smother the flames, but they were too late. Far too late. The centaur was dead. There could be no doubt about that. Jack sobbed quietly to himself. "You scum!" He wheeled and turned on the policeman. "You low-down, dirty son of a—" "All right, lad, that's enough of that. You can save your feelings for something else." "Why did you do it?" asked David. He hardly seemed as affected as Jack, just dazed and wondering. "Had to be done. Orders from far above my head, I'm afraid. If it's any consolation, lad, it didn't feel pain. It was just a laboratory experiment got loose. They should keep their security tighter at them government places." "What do you mean?" Jack asked. "Experiment?" "Genes, isn't it?" the policeman told them. "Had to be destroyed. No telling what damage it might have done. Now then, we'd prefer it if you didn't go talking about this to anyone. I've got both your names. Can you tell me where you're likely to be staying in the next couple of days?" "As far away from this as possible," Jack wanted to say, but David had already broken in with, "I think we might be sticking around for a couple of days. Maybe in the pub in Llanfair. Maybe I'll pitch our tents in a field." "Right, fine. Well, I'll be getting along now. Remember, not a word to anyone." He picked up his bike and walked off up the stream. When he was out of sight, Jack turned to David and asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. "Look, Jack, there's something going on here. I don't believe this stuff about government research, and neither did that policeman." "How could he just walk away from this like that?" Jack asked. "I mean, how could he?" "I think we should too. There's nothing we can do for him now. I think we should get down to the village, cash a couple of travellers' checks, and stay the night in the pub. Tomorrow morning we can raise hell about this." "But shouldn't we do something about the body?" Jack protested. "Like I said, there's nothing we can do for him. I've got photos, so we've got some evidence. I tell you, somebody's going to pay for this." Hugh and Janet were both shaken by their experience and sat in silence at the table, clutching their mugs tightly. Ace and the doctor stood in a corner of the kitchen and talked quietly to each other. After the animal had loped off into the distance, carrying the dead sheep easily between its jaws, they had huddled into the house, and the doctor had made a pot of tea. "Professor?" Ace asked. He didn't say anything, so she carried on. "It wasn't the dog on the loose, was it?" "No, Ace." "And it wasn't just an Alsatian, was it?" "Quite right, Ace." "It was a wolf, wasn't it?" "Canis lupus, commonly known as the grey or timber wolf. No, not that either. A much older relative, I should say. Definitely wolfish, though." Hugh looked up from the table. "But that's ridiculous, Doctor. There aren't any wolves in Wales." "Then there are some very solid hallucinations around. I'll go out and bring in the rest of the sheep for you, Hugh. And then, Ace, I think bed might be in order. We may have a lot to do tomorrow."